Order, order. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Philip Hollowbone. I'm the Member of Parliament for Kettering, which is in Northamptonshire. As you can see, I'm not Caroline Ansell, who's the MP for Eastbourne, who has been the kind sponsor of this event. But Caroline will be here. She was here and she will be back. And so really I'm just here to welcome all of you to the Houses of Parliament on Caroline's behalf for what I think is going to be a really super afternoon. The British Mandate, established over 100 years ago, is hugely significant for the development of the Middle East. And I personally feel that the State of Israel wouldn't exist today had it not been for the British Mandate. And I think it's really important that we understand the background to its granting and what's happened since. And we're blessed this afternoon by a panel of speakers who are dangerously overqualified to talk about this subject. We've got two colonels, can you believe, one of whom is also a Holocaust survivor and was also on the Exodus, and we've got a distinguished international lawyer all the way from Australia. So we couldn't really have a better panel, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. I just want to give you one little anecdote while I've got the chance. So I'm privileged to represent Kettering, which is 80 miles north of London. Even though it's only 80 miles north of London, it's a different world to where we are now. And in 1917, in the third Battle of Gaza, there were 6 young lads from a town called Desborough, located in the Kettering constituency, who all came from this little village, who were sent to a place they'd probably never heard of, thousands of miles away, to engage the Ottoman Empire. And very sadly, those 6 young lads were all killed on the same day in the third Battle of Gaza. And I had the privilege some years ago to visit the Commonwealth War Grave site in Gaza City and to lay a wreath on their graves. So even though we might not immediately think that the history of the mandate affects us today, there's for me, a very local connection to the impact that the British Empire had on the development of the State of Israel and, of course, the development of Jordan and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. I'm going to be taking copious notes, and I'm sure we'll all leave here at the end of the afternoon with so much more knowledge about this really important part of world history. So welcome to Parliament, and thank you for attending.
Thank you very much, Philip. Really appreciate you stepping in for our host, Caroline Ansell. And on behalf of Love Never Fails, who have been organising this event, we're very grateful to Caroline for hosting originally, Philip for stepping in. Love Never Fails, just to explain for those of you who aren't aware, we are a coalition of roughly 18 or so pro-Jewish Christian organisations in the UK. You may have come across us in the past. We put on an event in the Royal Albert Hall called Balfour 100 5 years ago. This is the programme from that event. And many of you here in the room were there. That was at the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration itself. Then 3 years later, we had planned for another event for the San Remo Resolution, 1920, the centenary of that event. In fact, we have people here who are going to be speakers at that event in Parliament, very much like this. However, as you understand, the pandemic happened, so we produced the booklet that you found on your chairs. That was produced in time for the actual centenary in April 1920, and with various different speakers, almost as an alternative for an event like this. We also put on an online webinar in October with various speakers on this subject as well, and that was well attended. Also a bit unusual, but it may do. So Yes, we are very grateful to our expert speakers, particularly to Lord Turnberg, who stepped in for Colonel Richard Kemp at the last minute. We're very grateful for him sharing his expertise with us. Each of the speakers today have quite a lot of experience, and they've also written books on what they're going to be speaking about. So the 15 minutes is not nearly enough time to say all that they have to say, but we'd encourage you to see their books as well. Their books will be on the table at the far end here, if you are interested. We also would encourage you on your way out to take another 2 or 3 books, these booklets with you from the chairs, particularly to give to those who you think might be interested. I would love to get this message out more widely. Also, Colonel Richard Kemp, who was going to be speaking for us, he and Hugh Kitson have created a documentary, a DVD, on Whose Land, looking at the background that we're going to talk about today. Dom is just holding it up for us. So do get one of those on your way out as well. Hugh has very kindly brought those along. So even though we didn't have Richard here, you can still hear him speak virtually. We should let you know that we're going to be videoing this event. That'll just be the program itself. So if you would rather not be videoed, please do avoid coming to the stage. And we trust it'll all be okay with you in terms of accepting your permissions for that to be videoed. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we will have a little bit of time for question and answer, as long as there's enough time for that, and then transition to the next speaker. Please do prepare your questions, and also try and make sure that they're actually a question rather than a statement. And so without further ado, please make sure your phones are on silent, so there isn't interruption. I'll need to do that myself. And we are inviting Lord Turnberg to give the first talk. I will point out, first of all, that these are the books that Lord Turnberg has written. First of all, in 2017, Beyond the Balfour Declaration, The 100-Year Quest for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. Highly recommend this book, very balanced book. And then, more recently, last year, Lord Turnberg has come out with a second book, focused in on the British Mandate itself, which is a mandate, the Palestine Crucible, 1919 to 1939. Do buy copies of this online. I'd encourage you to read. I've really been enjoying reading these recently. So, over to Lord Turnberg. Thank you very much. Oh, and sorry, let me just say, Lord Turnberg he was the president of the Royal College of Physicians before joining the House of Lords, and he has contributed a lot in health matters, but also increasingly in Israel-Palestine matters. So we appreciate you being with us.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very good introduction. I enjoyed the book about the business about the books. I'm not very keen to be a replacement for Richard Kemp. He's a marvellous speaker, so I'm afraid I apologise in advance if I can't keep up to that sort of standard. I've been asked to talk about the Balfour Declaration, how it came about, and why. Some say it was the biggest error of judgment any government could make. Others said it was the most magnanimous gesture of justice towards a persecuted people. Let me tell you about Arthur Balfour. He was the last person you might expect to be involved in this. He was a rather tall, thin, rather effete-looking aristocratic Scotsman who used to take to leaning on any available wall and slouching on the benches of the Houses of Parliament, rather like a latter-day Rees-Mogg. So he was the last person you would expect to do this. Then one day he surprised everyone by being made the Minister for Ireland, until it was realised he was made minister by Lord Salisbury, whose real name was Robert Cecil, who was his uncle. And when Bob's your uncle, of course, anything can happen. That's where it arose, that particular sentence. Well, he went on and became Prime Minister for a while, and then he was in Lord George's army battle cabinet during the war, and he was the Liberal member. And that was in 1917 when he produced the declaration, which you all know about. Now, why did he do it, and why did the cabinet do it? There have been a variety of reasons suggested. The first was it was to reward Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann was a keen Zionist, presenting the case to Balfour and to others, wherever he could. And he had invented, he was a chemist working in the University of Manchester, and he invented a way of producing acetone in very large amounts, and acetone was necessary for the war effort because it was used in the production of explosives. So they wanted to reward Weizmann. Was it that Balfour wanted to do? Hardly. Was it to try and persuade the American Jews to push the American president, to persuade the American president Woodrow Wilson to enter the war on the side of the Allies? They weren't in the war at that stage. Well, maybe, but they overestimated the power of the Jews in 1917 in America. Was it to stop the German Jews from going against the idea of a Balfour Declaration and against the Allies? Or was it because they wanted a friendly set of Jews in the Middle East to protect their strategic interests? There were all these reasons in the background, but they weren't sufficient. Balfour was quite a religious man, and he'd been persuaded about Zionism by Weizmann, but he'd already leant that way. Let me just read what he said at the time. "I've never pretended that it was purely from materialistic principles that I produced the Declaration." He then said in a speech, "Christian religion owes to Judaism an immeasurable debt that should be fully repaid. Here you have a small race originally inhabiting a small country, I think about the size of Wales, at no time in its history wielding anything that can be described as material power. We cannot forget how they have been treated during long centuries. Our whole religious organization in Europe has proved itself guilty of great crimes against this race." That's what he said in Parliament. When he was dying on his deathbed, he told his niece, Blanche Dugdale, who wrote his biography, that what he had done for the Jews was most worth his doing. So it was his sense of justice to the Jews that really promoted him. But of course he wasn't alone. He was strongly supported by Lord George, by the rest of the cabinet, and the Italians and the French and even the Pope were supportive, and a little later the USA. So it was a well-supported declaration. It wasn't just Balfour putting it forward. But of course, that wasn't the end. You must remember that this was not a treaty. This was not a commitment. This was the British government looking with favour on a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And of course it had this proviso, which has created problems ever since, that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the indigenous population, not the political rights, incidentally. How on earth is it possible to support and not prejudice the rights of the existing population and at the same time push forward another population to take over its land and to live there? So not an easy combination. And of course the whole thing could have been lost at any time. For example, during the time that this was going on, Lord George was trying to negotiate secretly with the Turks to bring them over to the Allies' side from the Germans and bring them to the Allies' side. If he would have done that, if they would have agreed, then the Turks would have held on to their Middle East empire, and I'm not entirely sure that they were going to be predisposed to allowing the Jews to enter there. So if he'd have been successful, that might have been the end of it, but he wasn't. The Turks decided to stay with the Germans. And then, of course, there was all sorts of opposition, which I'll come to in a moment or two. But It came up to the 1919 peace conference after the war. And Weizmann presented the case. It could have been lost at that time, but the great powers accepted the recommendation, and from then on it moved on, as I'll come to in a moment. But of course there were problems even then. You'll remember that France and Britain wanted to divide up the Turkish Empire, particularly the part in the Middle East, between them and have them as colonies. Colonies were out. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, said at the 1919 conference, no colonies now. India was trying to become not a colony. Ireland were trying to get freedom. So colonies were out. So they produced the idea of mandates. Mandates were supposed to be temporary affairs which allowed countries to develop under their own steam, and when they were capable of running their own affairs, then it would be handed over to them, the indigenous population. So mandates were temporary affairs, and everyone agreed, and between them, Britain and France set up their mandates, France for Syria and Britain for Mesopotamia, which included Palestine. I have to say that at that time there was King Hussein in Arabia and his son Faisal trying to get Britain to agree to giving them the whole of the Middle East, including Syria, for themselves, because they had helped, they say they had helped the Allies in their struggle against the Turks. They'd helped a little, but not marvelously. But they wanted to get this. Now, here it was destroyed. Until that time, Hussein and Faisal were favourably disposed to allowing the Jews into Palestine. They regarded Palestine as a poor backwater that they didn't really need, a small bit of land in their huge Arab empire. But then once the mandates were formed and France took over Syria, they hated the French. They remembered what they'd done in North Africa and they thought they were terrible. So once the French took over Syria, the Arabs of Palestine, who until then had been fairly content with being part of Pan-Arabism, part of the total Arab empire. But then once Syria took over, once France took over Syria, that was the moment when Palestinian nationalism arose. That was the moment when they determined that they wanted to look after themselves. Of course, Palestinian Arabs were mainly peasantry. They were run by the notable families who were in league with the Turks. They were in a cushy situation and they kept their peasantry down. But they were very disappointed with the fact that Syria was now part of France and they were left with Palestine and quite a lot of Palestine mandate. Of course, Churchill came along and divided off, with his straight lines in the sand, divided off Transjordan and divided off Iraq. That in recompense to the Hashemite family, he gave the emirate, made Abdullah the emir of Transjordan and his brother Faisal the emir of Iraq. So the question then arises, this was the situation. They went to San Remo, they approved the Balfour Declaration, they went to the League of Nations in 1922, approved at the League of Nations unanimously by all 56 nations, I think it was, and it was then agreed in international law that the mandate for Palestine should be British and the Jews should have not just a homeland there. This was strengthened by making it the homeland in Palestine. That was at the League of Nations. So the question then arises, having got to that point, incidentally, the Palestinians have since then suggested that the British should rescind the Balfour Declaration. Of course, it's no longer in their hands. It's in international law by the League of Nations and now by the United Nations. So Britain rescinding the Balfour Declaration will have no impact whatsoever. But the question then, during the 1920s, and I'll just come to this period, during the 1920s and 30s, when the mandate was in operation, how did the Jewish dream, the Zionist dream, survive when the Jews were outnumbered 10-1 by the Arabs, who were now up in arms and rioting against both the Jews and the administration, the British administration. And life was hard. So they were outnumbered 10-1. And the British government were beginning to lose heart. They did not need this headache in the Middle East when they were faced with all sorts of domestic problems at home. The economy was suffering. There were general strikes. They were having trouble keeping the Indian colony on board, and the Irish were revolting. So they had enough problems. They didn't need this problem in the Middle East. And there were debates in the Lords and in the Commons in which there was a vote in the Lords, actually, to stop the whole thing, to stop the mandate and to stop the whole thing going on. It was defeated by Churchill in the end, in the Commons, with a very pro-Zionist speech. And the whole thing became very awkward during that period of time. Immigration of Jews was variable. Occasionally it was less, immigration was less than emigration. And the reason was that there were plagues of locusts, there were earthquakes, there were all sorts of uncomfortable things going on, and water wasn't in great supply. Incidentally, one of the reasons why they were able to get through all this, they had good friends in Parliament, even though Churchill was not in office in the 1930s. And they had good friends in America, and they had financial support. And the people who were imported, who were immigrating into Palestine, were determined, young, active, full of life, full of ideas, European ideas about how to administer a new country, how to set up the basic principles of administration and development of a health service and a defense force and roads and so on. So they had the know-how, even though they were outnumbered 10-1. And they built and built. The Arabs, on the other hand, had no friends outside of Palestine. Even the other Arab nations in the early 1920s were busy setting their own countries up. They didn't have much concern for the Palestinians at that point. Only later did they. And so the poor Palestinians were not outnumbered, and no wonder they were frustrated, and no wonder they rioted, but they didn't have the sort of support that the Jews had at that moment. So they were having problems. It turns out that during that phase, there was a man, I have to mention him because I've just written a book about him. Pinchas Ruttenberg was a man who introduced hydroelectricity into a land that was lacking in water. How on earth did he do that? He was a Russian revolutionary, an assassin, who escaped in 1917, finished up in Palestine, persuaded the British government to give him the concession to put the hydroelectric plant in, and he did, on the Jordan River, put a huge dam on the Jordan River, and he electrified the whole of Palestine, which set up agriculture and industrialization. So that brings us, finally, I have to say, to about 1939, when all things became much worse. And the British government produced their white paper, which created big problems for the Jews. But then the war began, and the whole story moves on to areas which I'm not going to cover today. Thank you very much indeed.
We have time for questions.
Yes, yes.
So if anybody has questions, we've got time for a couple of minutes of questions.
the plant, I think it's actually Tel Aviv, is the Reading Tower and that aspect of the development.
Yes. Well, it was Ruttenberg's doing. He set up the hydroelectric plant on the Jordan River. Huge, huge thing. But before that, he set up a number of diesel plants. One in Jaffa, and then the one at the Reading one, named after Lord Reading, incidentally, who became the first chairman of the Palestine Electric Company. That one came rather later, late 1930s. But I can tell you a little story about how he was full of arrogance in the way that he was able to get. He wanted to put a hydroelectric plant on the Yarkon River, which runs near Tel Aviv. But the Yarkon River is a very poor stream, and he soon realized that there was no way it could generate enough electricity, enough power. So he'd been given permission for that. So he said to the British government, look, I can't put this plant on this river because the Arabs won't give me the land that I need. It was partly true. So he said, I will get that permission, just let me set up some diesel plants in the meanwhile. So they said, oh, okay. And he did. And furthermore, he got all the plant that he needed from Germany, which was the recently defeated Germany, and that was another bit of sleight of hand. He was quite a wheeler dealer.
Thank you.
I think we need to wrap up questions there to move on to the next speaker, but please thank Leslie Turnberg. How does this have an impact on the Jewish people with regard to the mandate? Now, Colonel Shaya Harsit, he is a Holocaust survivor, and with his wife as well, Tzippi. Also, I do want to mention also Loic Oliver Wolf, who's here, another Holocaust survivor in a lovely red jacket. Do have a word with her afterwards, and with Tzippi and Shaya. It's really important to hear their stories at this stage. And Shaya was actually air attaché in London here, 1969 to 1972. So he's come back to old stomping ground. Shaya has written up his memories in a book called A New Heavens and a New Earth. This is the Hebrew version. You can find the English version on Amazon. So do look that up. And we invite Shaya to come and speak to us now on the impact of the British mandate.
Thank you for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, shalom, peace. And when we say shalom, we mean it. But unfortunately, we didn't get it until this day. I have to apologize. My English is not my mother tongue, so I hope you will understand me. First of all, I'm honored to speak in front of you. As mentioned before, my name is Shaya Harsit, a retired colonel of the Israeli Air Force, a navigator. I was born in Warsaw, Poland, on the 3rd of October, 1934. I will tell you later about what I went through during the Holocaust and on the Exodus 1947 ship. Let's start with the Balfour Declaration issued on November 1917, stating, and I quote, Britain's aspirations for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the San Remo Treaty on the 24th of April 1920. The Assembly decided to give Britain the mandate on Palestine, including being obligated to the Balfour Declaration. The purpose of the British mandate as of 1920 was to assist the Jewish community in Palestine and to ensure a national Jewish home in Palestine. But unfortunately, in May 1939, Malcolm MacDonald, Minister of the State for Colonies, restricted the immigration of Jews to Palestine in what's called the 1939 White Paper. That White Paper was a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Treaty. Let's not forget that the White Paper was issued after the Kristall Night in November 1938. Hitler, damn him, wanted to export, and I'm using the word export, the Jews to other countries. But no country was willing to accept them. One example was the St. Louis ship. The St. Louis ship left Hamburg with around 1,000 Jews on board, sailed to Cuba, and then to the United States of America, and finally back to Hamburg. No country allowed entrance to those people that finally ended up in the gas chambers. I would like to remark that the Jerusalem Mufti al-Husseini was an ally of the Nazis and helped the British to put into practice the White Paper. He was one of the reasons that the British really wanted to apply the White Paper. Even though that Palestinian Jews enlisted the British armed forces and even established a Jewish brigade during the Second World War. I was born into a Zionist family, the youngest spoiled child. In mid-January 1940, part of my family escaped to Russian part of Poland to a town called Baranovichi, which today is Ukraine. One midnight we were arrested and charged as political enemies of the Soviet Union by being Polish citizens. With other Polish Jews, we were exiled on a cargo train to a hard labor camp in the Urals. Here I met the three terrible diseases which I faced until the end of 1944: hunger, bitter cold, and lice. In 1943, my eldest brother and sister were murdered by the Nazis. In May 1945, we returned to Warsaw, that had been totally destroyed, and from there to Munich, the American part of Germany. The Jewish American organization joined, settled us in a small, beautiful village called Neufreimann that was built for SS officers' families. We lived there a normal life after so many what happened to us during the war. Warm heating, food, nice houses, etc. And that was until 1947. A teacher by the name Geula was sent by the Jewish agency to teach the children Hebrew and the geography of Eretz Israel. One day, she told me that the liberator of Europe, General Eisenhower, was visiting the refugee camps. And at that event, she wanted me to recite in Hebrew to the General Eisenhower, poem To the Bird, written by our national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik. I was so excited that until his visit, I almost didn't sleep, didn't eat or play, and learned the poem like a parrot. When Eisenhower arrived, at a certain stage, I recited the poem, and at the end, he stood up and hugged me. Then I said to myself, what a funny situation. He, of course, didn't understand one single word, but I didn't understand as well one single word. At that suburb of Munich, we lived until, as I said before, beginning of July 1947. For the time being, we knew that a bitter struggle was going on in Palestine against the British mandate by the Haganah, the Etzel, and the Lehi. Avshalom Chaviv, cousin of my wife, Tzipi, a member of the Etzel, was caught by the Brits while trying to release Etzel prisoners from the Acre prison. He was sentenced to death with two other Etzel freedom fighters. They could have asked the mercy from the King of England and get life imprisonment. But they didn't want to. Everyone in the country tried to convince them, but they totally refused to do so. And on the 29th of July, 1947, they were hanged in the Eker prison. Avshalom Haviv was 21 years old. And now back to us. On July the 9th, 1947, we were taken on American trucks, on American military trucks, driven by American Jewish soldiers to the south of France, and on the 11th of July, we boarded the most famous illegal ship, Exodus 1947. At midnight, after a lot of difficulties, Exodus departed Port Said in south of France towards Palestine, Eretz Israel, the Promised Land, with 4,554 Jewish refugees on board. From the first day, we were followed by 6 Royal Navy battleships until the night of the struggle, about 30 miles from the shores of Palestine. The ship was strongly damaged, 1 crew member and 2 refugees were killed, and 150 were wounded. Exodus was dragged by 2 cruisers to the port of Haifa. We saw Mount Carmel, but couldn't enter into the Promised Land. As God said to Moses, you will see the land, but not be allowed to enter. On July the 18th, 1947, we were dragged by force onto 3 iron deportation cargo ships back to the south of France. While the temperature was around 30 centigrade, almost zero ventilation, and anchored near Port de Boux for more than 3 weeks. The Brits wanted us to disembark the ships and stay in France, while our answer was, no, we want back to Palestine. Even though that the conditions were terrible on the ships, beyond any human standards. All over the world, the events of Exodus were on the front pages of all newspapers and radio broadcasts. After 3 weeks, the ships sailed through Gibraltar to Hamburg, and on the 8th of September 1947 arrived at the port of Hamburg. This was the most shocking anti-Semitic decision made by Ernst Bevin, the Foreign Affairs Minister of the United Kingdom. The decision was to return the dirty Jews, I am quoting, the dirty Jews, to the most hated place, Germany. As before, we were dragged by force and transferred on 2 trains to 2 depot camps, Amstau and Peppendorf. Those camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and dogs. We were in Amstau, our family was in Amstau, where I became 13 years old, and there I had my bar mitzvah. The conditions in Amstau were little better than on the ships, but far from being normal. And on the 29th of November, 1947, the state of Israel was declared by the United Nations. We were freed, and within 2 weeks, via Marseille, sailed legally to our new country, Israel. The main reasons for terminating the mandate and the declaration of the State of Israel were the Holocaust, the voice and the pressure of the survivors, the international pressure, and the last but not least, the events of Exodus. After we arrived in Israel and settled down in Jaffa, I went to a normal school for the first time in my life. I graduated high school in July 1954, volunteered for the Flying Academy of the Israeli Air Force, and on March 25, 1956, graduated as second lieutenant and a navigator. Well, I must tell you, I felt like I was on the top of the world. I, the child that escaped the Nazi regime, became an Israeli officer. I fought in the wars of 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982. Among other duties, I was air attaché in the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and Finland during the years 69 to 72. During my stay in the United Kingdom, one of my best friends was Air Marshal Mickey Martin, commander of the Royal Tactical Air Force. My last duty in the Air Force was head of planning and organization of the Israeli Air Force. My flying career was close to 4,000 flying hours, among them 1,500 operational. And now a few important words about my family. I have been married since 1956 to the most clever, gentle, beautiful, and beloved woman, Zipi. She is also a Holocaust survivor. We are blessed with 3 daughters, 3 sons-in-law, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. All of them are our biggest treasure and my greatest revenge to Hitler and the Nazi regime. My country, Israel, is my second treasure, the only place where Jews can live and as free and protected people. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. It was tremendously exciting to receive the invitation to today's event, and I'm very pleased not only to be here, but to hear testament that we've heard. So I wanted to say a few words in response to Shaya, and particularly to his wife, Tipsy, because they represent the hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who suffered during the British Mandate for Palestine. Events like this make me consider books such as Exodus by Leon Uris, when he said, why must we fight for the right to live over and over each time the sun rises? And that's something that Jewish people have had to endure over many, many years. So it truly was an honour for the United Kingdom to be entrusted with the responsibility for the mandate. The Jewish people have been in exile for 18 centuries, 2,000 years, and the United Kingdom was given the unique privilege of helping them to reconstitute their national home in the land of their ancestors. But we shouldn't forget that this was a very difficult period, and a time of great suffering for many people, particularly coming after not only World War II, but after the Shoah, where so many people were extinguished. But as British representatives of a new generation, I am proud of our relationship with Israel, and we want to continue the trust between our two countries, to have more faithful friends in Israel and the Jewish community worldwide. So we commit ourselves not only to opposing anti-Semitism, but also to fighting against it in any areas that we find it, in all its forms that we perceive. And we pray to God to send out his light and the truth to guide our feet in the way of peace. One day Israel will have the true peace it desperately needs, and that's when its people can feel safe and secure in the country that is rightfully theirs. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we move on to the third talk, and this will be taking us from looking at the history from the start of the State of Israel through to the present day. So that's a big task, but we do have an expert speaker to speak to us on this topic. Andrew Tucker is a very experienced lawyer on the question of international law related to the Jewish people. He was educated in Oxford, he's from Australia, educated in Oxford, married a Dutch woman and lives in the Netherlands. And he set up something called the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. He wrote this substantial book, Israel on Trial, How International Law is Being Misused to Delegitimize the State of Israel. And in case you're a bit intimidated by the size of that, there is a short summary of the executive conclusions that is much easier to read. There are a few copies of this over on the table here. and actually some copies of the book as well. Do talk with Andrew about that afterwards. But we are honoured to have him speak to us today on the significance of the mandate for subsequent international law relating to Israel. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honour, really, and a privilege for me to stand here and share with you. I think we are living in a momentous moment in world history. 100 years since the end of the First World War. And we have attempted over the last 100 years to create a legal system that will ensure peace and security in the world. And I think the events of the last months and years have shown us that this system is failing us badly. I think the UN system that we created in 1945 has shown itself to be a miserable failure in preventing war and ensuring security. And I think that is especially the case for Israel and for the Jewish people. I want to share with you a little bit about the mandate and what has happened to the mandate. I think if you talk with your friends and family at a birthday party about the mandate for Palestine, they'll probably wonder what on earth you're talking about. It's not a topic of general talk, is it? It's not something we often learn at school, at least I didn't, although I grew up in Australia, so that's probably not surprising. Although we played an important role, didn't we, Kelvin, in the whole history of leading up to the mandate and beyond. Nevertheless, I never heard anything about the mandate for Palestine. I never heard anything about how the State of Israel was created. And I think that's true for many of us. And therefore, I think it's important that we go back to the roots of the State of Israel. And that is very much the mandate. The mandate, of course, was a new legal system at the time, as we've heard. After the First World War, when the Allied powers conquered these vast territories of former empires, German and Ottoman empires, and were suddenly confronted with the question, what do we do with all of this territory? And under the influence of President Woodrow Wilson, the principle of self-determination began. So we're talking about a moment in history. We move from empires over century. We're moving into an era of statehood. This is completely new legal territory. The concept of a state is, of course, a very Western European thing, isn't it? It comes from the Westphalian system. And it emerged in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries as a Western idea of international relations. It built around states who respect each other and respect their sovereign equality. And so the idea was how to use this idea and to bring it into these vast territories that have known nothing of statehood. They know nothing about the Western institutions that we're so used to. And it was a very, I suppose, in a sense, colonial idea that we will bring our Western idea of statehood to these uncivilized people who will, under our tutelage, learn to become self-supporting and independent. So yes, there's an element of colonialism in the mandates, but I think they were genuinely an attempt to enable the populations and the peoples of the Middle East and half of Africa and many other parts of the world to truly achieve the independence that they deserved. It was called a sacred trust of civilization, the mandate system. So it was not treated lightly. And it was a genuine attempt to enable peoples of regions who had formerly been part of empires to become self-sufficient. Unfortunately, today, the State of Israel, which was created out of the mandate for Palestine, is subject to, I think, the most unprecedented assault on its legitimacy, its very existence, and its territory than we have ever seen. I think we should realize what is happening today to the State of Israel. Throughout the United Nations institutions, right up to the very top, into the judicial institutions, the very existence of the Jewish state is being questioned. It's been called an apartheid state. It's been compared with South Africa as a pariah state that doesn't deserve to exist as a Jewish state. We've determined what its territory should be. We've decided that the Jews should be kept in a kind of little ghetto in the western part of Palestine. And we've said that there will be a Palestinian state that is built on the determination to destroy the Jewish people. This is the state that we've decided to create. This is the policy of the Western nations, and unfortunately it's still the policy of this nation. We mustn't forget this, and I think we need to confront this. The mandate for Palestine has been forgotten. I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in the International Criminal Court, for example. In the United Nations Human Rights Council has established a commission of inquiry to investigate in perpetuity the state of Israel. It has determined already in its first report published just 2 months ago that the state of Israel is responsible for the conflict. Why? Because it's occupying Palestinian territory. So if we remove the Jews from Jerusalem, if we remove the Jews from Judea and Samaria, we solve this problem and we create world peace. That's the idea. That's how far we've come. And I think it's partly because we've forgotten what the mandate for Palestine was all about. Let's just think for one moment about that mandate for Palestine. It was unique amongst all the mandates in several respects. First of all, it recognized the Jewish people as having a unique connection with this territory that had become known as Palestine. Palestine, why Palestine? This is the name the Romans had given to the territory when Hadrian, in his day, after the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of Jerusalem, wanted to destroy every remnant of Jewish connection with the territory known as Judea. So we've called it Palestine, and we still call it Palestine. That's the territory that the international community accepted and realized in that very small moment when Lord Balfour was there, that they had this unique connection and deserved the right to re-establish their homeland in Palestine. So first of all, it recognized the Jewish people. Of course, it also recognized there are many other peoples living in Palestine. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, it recognized as a national home, this idea of a national home, also unique amongst the mandates. That there's something about the concept of a national home which leads towards statehood. A people has a right to self-determination, but only a nation has a right to statehood. So the essence of the Palestine mandate was that the Jewish people would eventually have a state of their own. Again, I'll come back to that. Thirdly, territory. It was, of course, recognized that you cannot have a state, you cannot truly be a national people in a land unless you have a territory with borders. So borders were established. And fourthly, it recognized the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Again, quite unique amongst the mandates system. And this was a reference to the many different ethnic communities living in Palestine at the time. The Palestinian Arabs were, of course, many of them not Arabs at all, but they'd come from many parts of Europe, Africa, and other parts of the world. The Palestinians are a mix of many ethnic and cultural diverse backgrounds. So these are the main component parts of the mandate for Palestine. The preamble to the mandate stated that recognition is thereby being given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. The historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine referred to their long connection, and the grounds for reconstituting their home referred, of course, to the pogroms in Russia and in Europe. and the recognition that the Jews were already, and had been for decades, returning to Palestine because there was no place for them in Europe, as of course Herzl recognised and realised in the latter part of the 19th century. Now, it was clear that the result of the mandate would in some way be a state, but it was left very much vague. The terminology of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine is of course rather ambiguous, and that was quite deliberate. Nobody quite knew at the time how this state would come into being. The Jews had to return from the diaspora in order to re-establish and rebuild this state, and somehow they had to come to terms with the local populations. How this was going to work, nobody could tell. And yet at the time it was envisaged in an almost prophetic sense that one day there would be this Jewish independent national home. And yes, it was going to be a state, even though a state was not referred to in the mandate. And so Article 2, the central provision of the mandate says the mandatory, Great Britain shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home as laid down in the Balfour Declaration, and the development of self-governing institutions and the safeguarding of the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. So there was to be an administration, which is further developed in Article 6 of the mandate. And the mandate refers also to the right of the Jewish people to return, to immigrate into Palestine. And significantly, it refers to the right of the Jewish people to settle in Palestine. Isn't that amazing? We talk about settlements today. There's only one document, as far as I'm aware, in international law which talks specifically about settlements. It's the Mandate for Palestine. And it's talking about Jewish settlement and the right to Jewish settlement in Palestine. Now, we don't have time to go into the details, but the territory of the mandate were established by a series of agreements after the mandate came into existence. And it was to include not only what is current-day Israel, not only what is current-day West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, but also Jordan was originally intended to be part, and was part, of the Mandate for Palestine, until Britain enabled a provision to be inserted in the mandate to enable it to separate Transjordan from Western Palestine, which it did, and that was Churchill's attempt to pacify the Arabs and give them an Arab-Palestinian state. So we already have a two-state solution, in my view, created when the state of Jordan was in embryo, established by Transjordan. It's often said that the non-Jews were not recognised at the time of the mandate. That's their claim, of course. It has been for 100 years that they were not recognised. And of course they were, because we see them referred to in the mandate. The Jewish people were given the political rights, but the civil and religious rights were to be protected. And I think the mandate, in a sense, provides for us a paradigm of a modern democratic liberal state, which has national identity, but respects the civil and religious rights of every citizen, regardless of race or religion, which is terribly important. And Israel today is the only country in the Middle East where that is in fact the case. And I could go on about how the Arabs and the Palestinian Arabs were involved throughout the mandate period in discussions time and again in London and elsewhere about how to reconcile them with the Jewish people. And time and again, under al-Husseini, the Arabs refused every possibility of a partition of Western Palestine. Even right up to the partition plan in 1947, the Arabs have rejected partition because they reject the right of the Jewish people to a state. And that, in my view, is still the case today. The PLO is established with the objective of liberating the whole of Palestine. That is Israel's negotiating partner under the Oslo Accords. And I think it's becoming apparent in the new discussions in the international institutions that the PLO is still committed to this long-term objective of liberating Palestine. The PLO has never, the Palestinians have never amended their charter as Arafat promised to do in Oslo in 1993 to remove the provisions which talk about the destruction of the Jewish state. And so they're committed. They never commit themselves to any territorial situation. They don't commit themselves to a two-state solution because they keep open the option that they will have the sovereignty over all of Palestine, including what is the State of Israel. So I have 1 minute to explain to you what happened. What happened to the mandate? Where did it go? Well, I think what happened in 1948, everybody was so busy about establishing the state that nobody had time to think about the legal significance of the mandate for Palestine. And it slipped in a way into, it was lost. The Jews were busy surviving. Israel was busy surviving the wars of aggression that were fought against it right up until 1973. And it's only been recently when legal proceedings have been brought in the international institutions when people are starting to think, well, hang on a moment, what is the legal foundation of the State of Israel? What are its borders? And now the mandate for Palestine has come back onto the table in a significant way. And in a very short way, I can say to you, the mandate for Palestine determined the borders of the State of Israel in 1948. The United Nations did not create the State of Israel. The partition plan did not create the State of Israel. The State of Israel was created by the Jewish people who declared their independence. The Palestinians could have declared their state in 1948. Every possibility for them to have done it, and I think the world would have accepted it. They didn't. The Jews did, and under the principle of uti possidetis juris, that's the only Latin term you're going to get from me today, hang on to it, mandate territory boundaries become the boundaries of a succeeding state. That's the way Syria was created, the way Iraq was created, and many, many states in Africa and the rest of the world who emerged out of mandates. The administrative boundaries of the Palestinian mandate in law became the boundaries of the State of Israel. What is that? That's at least to the Jordan River. But of course, Israel never took control of that because they were fighting a war of aggression against it, as they subsequently had to do. They've never had the capacity. And in 1967, when Israel took back territory, it made a choice not to exercise sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria. That's a political choice Israel has made. But it has never abandoned its legal rights. So I want to conclude by saying that there is a lot of work to be done today in the institutions. And it's happening in The Hague at the moment. So I feel privileged to work in The Hague. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court are just going through a process where the Criminal Court wants to prosecute Israeli leaders for enabling Jews to live in East Jerusalem. If you can get your head around that, then I can't. It's totally ignoring history. The International Court of Justice in 2004 barely even referred to the mandate, let alone the mandate being intended for the Jewish people. We've forgotten our history and we've allowed history to be forgotten. So we have to catch up on 50 years, I think. And this is a legal battle. There is a war of lawfare happening today in these institutions. I think the mandate, I wish I had more time to go into it, but I think the mandate provides, in a way, I think because of the paradigm that it created of nationhood with respect for individual rights, it provides a wonderful paradigm for statehood in the Middle East, a region which is thirsting for guidance, thirsting for recognition. So therefore, I believe the State of Israel is the model, something we should hold on to and respect, and we must defend the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state of Israel with secure borders in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. What a remarkable summary of the legal situation. For much more detail, Andrew has a couple of articles in this booklet, Pathway for Peace, and as he said at the end, it's really important to see how this is a pattern for peace throughout the Middle East. It's not just taking sides in the discussion, it's actually saying there's a good foundation here. So for concluding remarks, we're delighted to have Claudine Austin here, and over to you.
Firstly, thank you, and let me thank you and Jacob and everybody from the Love Never Fails Coalition for organising what I think has been a fantastic discussion today. Absolutely brilliant. And I want to thank all of you for being here to celebrate the Balfour Declaration, the subsequent establishment of Israel, and everything this miracle country has achieved in the decades since. And I think we should thank Caroline for organising and for hosting this event. Let's give Caroline a big round of applause. And I just want to say, sitting at the back of the room is the great, formidable Baroness Deitch, who's a real heroine, and someone I really look up to and follow her lead in the House of Lords, and does great work all year round for Israel. Now, we've had some fascinating speakers, absolutely brilliant speakers today, and I was really struck by what we just heard, reminding us that the modern democratic state of Israel reflects the two core values of the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate: establishing a Jewish homeland and robust protection of minority rights. And that was the original pathway for peace. And this is the point really that I want to start with. I want to pick up on something Andrew said. And it's this, whether it's students on campus, activists at Amnesty who don't know what they're talking about, or members of Parliament who ought to know better, the use of the word apartheid is a complete and utter disgrace when linked to Israel. A complete disgrace. And it's an insult. It's an insult not only to the Middle East's only democracy, but it's actually an insult to black South Africans who suffered under a brutal system of racial segregation. It's worth noting there's a brilliant article in this week's Jewish Chronicle by someone who grew up in South Africa, imprisoned as a teenager, suffered for protesting against apartheid, and he points out that whatever people say, Nelson Mandela, although he may have had criticisms of actions or policies of individual Israeli governments, he never once described Israel as an apartheid state. And these people knew more about apartheid, let's be honest, than anybody at Amnesty International ever will. Every area of government and people's lives in South Africa was based on the colour of skin. Schools, colleges, universities, the civil service, police, military, the judiciary, all run under a strict system of segregation. In Israel, all of them, every single one, completely integrated. Black people in South Africa were not even allowed to vote. Think about this. 400 million Arab citizens living in 24 countries stretched all the way across the Middle East. The only Arab citizens that get to choose their governments in what we would recognise as anything approaching free and fair elections are the ones in Israel, the only ones. And the Knesset they elect is the most disputatious and diverse legislature anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. It represents all parts of Israel's multi-ethnic society. An Arab party has been part of the governing coalition, a government that has Jews and Arabs serving alongside each other. So the campaign to brand Israel as an apartheid state is not just a smear on the region's only democracy, but it's a barrier to any sort of peace process as well, and any solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because demonising Israel, singling it out for criticism, holding it to standards never applied to other countries. This drives people apart, and it makes dialogue and discussion much more difficult. And it also gives the Palestinian leadership the impression, the excuse, that pressure from organisations like Amnesty or other countries, governments, political parties or campaign organisations around the world might lead to a Palestinian state, when this will only, in fact, be achieved by a Palestinian leadership that's prepared to negotiate and prepared to find a way to living peacefully side by side with Israel. And worse than all of that, these campaigns fuel racism, anti-Semitism here on the streets of Britain, as we saw just last year, because they fuel this anti-Israel obsession. They used to justify attacks on people who identify with or who support the Jewish state. But the biggest insult of all, is smearing as racist a state set up as a safe haven for victims of racism. Absolutely disgraceful. A state founded as a refuge from centuries of anti-Semitism after the Nazis attempted to murder the entire race. And this leads me on to my second point, really, which is Thomas is here from Labour Friends of Israel, and I think we should give. They've got the hardest job in pro-Israel advocacy in the Labour Party at the moment, so we should give LFI a round of applause for everything they do. And let's be honest, they've got their work cut out tackling the obsession with and hostility to Israel that characterised the Labour Party under Corbyn's appalling leadership. And this is completely completely unrelated to the history of the Labour Party. In recent years, Israel had strong, steadfast supporters in Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, but it goes back much further than that. 3 months before the Balfour Declaration, Labour published its War Aims Memorandum, which endorsed Jewish claims to settlement in Palestine. That was the position Labour repeatedly affirmed over the following decades. It would not have been possible, Harold Wilson wrote, for a political party to be more committed to a national home for the Jews in Palestine than was Labour. The cornerstone of Balfour, as we've heard today, rests on a very simple principle: the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and a state of their own. Opponents of Balfour, as we've also heard from Andrew just now, past and present, reject that principle. They've done it for a century. They continue to do it today. And that is why Arab nations invaded the newly established Israel instead of implementing the UN Petition Plan in 1947, which proposed a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and attempted to wipe Israel off the map again in 1967 and 1973. And it's why when Yasser Arafat was offered a Palestinian state at Camp David, he would not accept that the deal was final, because again, as we heard from Andrew, because Palestinian claims on the territory of pre-1967 Israel would therefore have to end. And it's why Hamas and Hezbollah continue to wage war against Israel, and the supreme leader of Iran suggests that the, quote, barbaric Jewish state has, quote, no cure but to be annihilated. Now we hear much today about the section of Balfour which refers to safeguarding the rights of, quote, existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But rarely mentioned by Israel's critics is the fact that Balfour also spoke of the need to uphold the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews outside of Palestine. Yet more than 800,000 Jews were forced from their homes across the Middle East after 1948. Large and long-standing Jewish communities were decimated. There were 140,000 Jewish people in Algeria in 1948. Now there are less than 50. There were 75,000 Jews in Egypt. There are now less than 20. There were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. Today you could count them on the fingers of both of your hands. Now, as we mark the events of 100 years ago, I think we should also look to the future. I want to see Britain, our government, doing everything it can to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, to promote dialogue, to build trust, to encourage negotiation. So I'll keep pushing for Britain to develop closer links with Israel, to promote economic development and trade in the West Bank, reconstruction and demilitarisation in Gaza. And this brings me on to the final thing I want to say. I've got what I think is the best job in the. It's not really in the government, but I'm the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Israel, and there is no way I'll be resigning. I can promise you that. No way. And it's my job to work with the Department for International Trade and our brilliant ambassador Neil Wigan and his team in Tel Aviv to encourage British companies to export to Israel and Israeli businesses to invest here in the UK, boosting prosperity, creating jobs, most important of all, bringing our two countries closer together. Now, Britain's relationship with Israel is stronger than it's ever been. Record levels of cooperation in trade and investment, in technology and innovation. Hundreds of businesses, thousands of jobs here in the UK depend on trade and investment between our two countries. The UK is Israel's third largest trading partner. British exports were worth £2.7 billion in 2020, and overall trade worth almost £5 billion. And despite the pandemic, Israeli investment in the UK was worth over 200 million last year alone. We're exporting clothes and cars, power generators, aircraft engines, medical equipment, scientific instruments, and pharmaceutical products. Some of you will be pleased to hear that the exports of Scotch whisky are up 300%. But more importantly, 1 in 7 of the NHS's drugs comes from Israel. Israeli IT and computer software are used by families and businesses around the country every day of the week. And university partnerships are working on life-saving technologies and treatments. Now, usually we only hear about Israel on campuses when it's protests and all of that. But the truth is, as I say, these partnerships are developing cures for dementia, for cancer, for long-term conditions which affect millions of people around the world. And inward investment from Israel has increased significantly in recent years, with over 500 Israeli companies working in the UK, and their investment again has provided thousands of jobs. And what lies behind this, I think, is Israel's unparalleled creative technology and the UK's long-standing records in business and industry. And I think that's a perfect match. But I think there's something much more important, much more fundamental, which is our shared values and our support for the Middle East-only democracy and truly free society. And we're going to build on this with a new trade deal, which we're working on at the moment, and that will produce great benefits for businesses. It'll create thousands of good, new, well-paid jobs in both countries by liberalising and opening up trade, especially in areas like financial services, infrastructure, technology, life sciences, AI, cybersecurity, or by removing or lowering tariffs for major UK exports, such as food and drink. And I promise you that we're going to do, I see this as the foundation for doing everything we can to bring these two countries closer together, because I think boosting prosperity, creating jobs is the best answer any of us could have to the anti-Israel obsessives who single Israel out or hold the world's only Jewish state to standards never applied to any other country. And so finally, I just want to say this. I think this event is so important because listening to experts, as we have done today, like Leslie and Andrew, equipping ourselves with the facts about Israel and the Middle East, but also about the Holocaust, about the history of centuries of anti-Semitism and Israel's existence, why establishing a country, a safe haven for the Jewish people, why all of this was so vital. All of this enables us to tell the truth about Israel in our local communities, in the media, on campuses, wherever we have to win these arguments. So I just want to say this as I conclude. Be inspired by what you've heard from the experts we've listened to today. Keep writing your letters, organising your meetings, lobbying your MPs, campaigning in your communities. You never know the impact of each email you write, every conversation you have, every letter you send, every connection you make. You never know the impact that could have, the lives that could change, the arguments you could win. So keep campaigning, keep making those connections, keep standing up for what's right, have confidence in your support for Israel and everything you do to bring these two great countries closer together. Thank you very much for being here today.